Muito obrigado e desculpa que não falo português. So first of all, let me just thank all of you, thank the organizers for this opportunity. I'm honored to be the only person from Asia in the room, I think. Let me also begin on a personal note. My own time as a student activist, I studied in Canada, was spent campaigning with, for example, the Zapatistas in Mexico, campaigning against NAFTA, campaigning against the multilateral agreement on investments, against the ALCA. And a lot of the discussions today and yesterday have really reminded me of those histories, of those struggles, and reminded me that the struggle continues. That said, I mean, I think I felt a little bit maybe depressed after some of the, and first of all, thanks to Professor Marta as well. I think this is a great presentation, and a lot of what I say is going to build on it. But before I get to that, let me just say that for us, coming from Asia, or even people, I work a lot in Africa these days as well, when I hear people in Latin America basically saying that, oh, we're not going anywhere and things are going backwards, and some of these regional initiatives that we had started, like ALBA or Mercosur or Banco do Sul, whatever you want to talk about, that it's not really going as far as they could. Part of me is agreeing with them, because of course you have a point when you say this, but part of me is also saying, my God, if these guys are saying we haven't gone far enough, how much further do we have to go in Asia and Latin America? Because we are not even close to as far as you are. So we still see Latin America as the hope. We still look to you. We people's movements, people's struggles, labor unions, social movements, we see Latin America as the region that has advanced the most. I can talk about this a lot, if you like, but in India, for example, we have as many people who are in danger of starvation as the whole of the African continent. Inequality is going up, as you know, in most of the world, in fact, in almost the entire world, with the exception of this region, of the Southern American region. So for all of the faults, and there are faults that we will get to, and that you've already discussed, I think you all have a lot to be proud of. Poverty is down, inequality is down, but social protections that have been implemented on, shall we say, a parallel track. Let me get to that in a second. So if we look at the model, if we look at sort of the promises of people like Lula, even people like Chavez and so on, their promises were to some extent fulfilled. I mean, we have to be real about that. What they did, in my opinion, is that they built a kind of a parallel track. They did not challenge the neoliberal model. Maybe it's neocolonial as well. We will get to that. They did not challenge the neoliberal model per se, but they built a sort of parallel track. And I think Brazil is a fantastic case study for this. Because when I challenge, and I've had to challenge the role of people like Mr. Cosende, who I also see in international spaces sometimes. We sometimes have arguments in the UN or other places. When I see people like that, and I see often that they are representing, Brazilian business, but a certain kind of Brazilian business. I mean, he mentioned Vale, he mentioned some of these other big companies, but he's not mentioning, the small family farmer initiatives and so on that have been protected under a certain system that was implemented by Lula. And those of you who are Brazilian know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you who aren't, you can talk to the Brazilian person next to you, and you'll figure it out. That said, so that neoliberal model that we inherited, it was a model, it was a model that we were forced to take on. By we, I'm just talking collectively. Everyone who has had the experience of colonialism, every country that has had this experience, had to go through this process. We were forced violently. We didn't have much choice about it. We resisted. Our resistance, we have to be honest, in large part failed. What was the colonial economy about? It was about taking the natural resources of this big colony, big supposedly unpopulated colony, forget about the indigenous peoples and so on. You can kill off the indigenous population if you can. Take the materials, the gold in the soil, the ivory in Africa, the sugar cane here in Brazil, using slave labor sometimes. Take that and take it to the rich countries for some further processing, right? For value added, right? And this is exactly where we come to what we just learned about China. So not to say that China was part of that colonial system, but the relationship with China right now looks a lot like that colonial system. And I'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later. But basically, you take cheap raw materials, you manufacture them, and you sell them back to the bigger markets, because there are a lot more people in the so-called third world than in the developing countries. You sell them back to the developing countries, and the profits remain with the rich countries. That is the colonial economic model. And we were forced to do that. We were also forced to do that by the IMF in the 1980s and 90s, which exploited the debt crisis to force us into the same colonial patterns of trade and so on. So here we get to the, and I mean, I can talk a lot about structural adjustment and so on, and the role of the IMF, but I think most of you know without being told that. I think you've lived the history. And it's here really that we need to get back to China. When we talk about BRICS, I know that BRICS is the name of this panel, but actually in all of the discussions we've had, and we've had many, I know some of you came to discussions we hosted in Mozambique. Many of you were part of the Fortaleza work that you guys did last year. So in all of these discussions that I've been privileged enough to witness over the past several years, there are basically two tracks. And the track that people are less interested in about is the BRICS track, is what is going on formally with BRICS as an institution. What are they agreeing on? Yes, there are some agreements and so on. But the second track, which everyone is very interested to talk about, is what is the role of China? Because let's be real, China is just so much bigger than all of the other countries, even combined, that really we have to talk about that as separate. And so I really appreciate the presentation of Marta in really teasing out some of these aspects. Also, someone, I can't remember who, referred to China yesterday. And here I'm getting back to the political economy discussions of yesterday. Someone referred to China as a comprador, and someone else referred to China as a subcolonial, or basically, you know, taking its orders from Washington and so on. I think that's naive. I think that's incorrect. I think China, to be honest, and I spent quite a bit of time in China, from the Chinese perspective, it worked in the system that existed, and it tried to play the game, and it successfully did it. So you know, if we look at the Chinese model, it was driven by a few things, maybe some of which are not replicable, but I can talk about them. So one is that you have this slow but quite steady, and over the course of 15 years, you have the migration of people in China from rural areas to urban areas. And what that effectively did, now they needed jobs and so on to make that happen. Huh? This is something to be said. But what that effectively did is when you take someone who has traditionally been living, say, a more subsistence kind of lifestyle, they grow their own grain. Yes, they sell some of the grain as well, but they grow their rice, they grow their wheat, they raise their own animals and so on. You take that person and you put him or her in the city, suddenly that person has to buy everything that they used to make for themselves. And that money, it may not be a lot of money at the individual level, but when you're talking in China, you're talking about millions and hundreds of millions and even a billion, right? When you move it to that level, that increases the amount of money. When you measure GDP, all you're really measuring is money changing hands. Huh? It increases the amount of money changing hands dramatically, and that is a large part of what has fueled this 6%, 7%, 8% GDP growth over the last 10 or 15 years. That is one piece of it. Another piece that you may be more familiar with is the fact that China in the 1990s, and I'm talking now largely before China even joined the World Trade Organization, before these kind of trade patterns were established. In the 1980s and 90s, China built up an industrial base and offered its cheap labor. It would not pay, especially up until a change in the minimum wage law in 2010, 2011, Chinese workers were extremely underpaid. It used that cheap labor as a tool for making that industry. So they would import whatever it may be, cotton, and they would make very substandard garments, very cheap garments, for sale to the international markets. I'm talking now 20 years ago. At the moment, of course, if you look at your clothes here in Brazil, you will not see any of them made in China unless it's at the higher end. So there's been a transformation. And if you read any development economist, that transformation that China has undergone is exactly how any northern country developed. You start out with, it has nothing to do with raw materials. Huh? China has not exploited. China has a lot of raw materials. China has not exploited most of them. China has not built mines. China has not built that many dams compared to how many It could. China and other parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, that have developed, have not done so by mining, by extracting, by agriculture. They have done so by processing, by taking raw materials or semi-finished goods, adding value, and then selling them to international markets. Ha-Joon Chang, of course, the Korean economist who teaches in Cambridge, is the best person to read about this, but almost any development economist will tell you very similar stories. So at the end of the day, after this process has gone on for 10 or 15 years, what do you have? You have a system very much like what Marta has described. You have a country that is a very big country that has been able to exploit various advantages to increase its flow of raw materials coming in and increase the flow of finished goods going out. And frankly, given China's options, given the fact that you had 1 billion people living in poverty in 1980 in China, or 700 million, given the various options that they had, you can understand why they took the road that they took. It's a perfectly logical thing. And this, I would distinguish from the International Monetary Fund and from the colonial economics that precedes it, in the sense that there is no compulsion. I hate to introduce yet another language, but there's a very good phrase from the Quran. Sorry, I'm raised as a Muslim. I'm recovering. I'm a socialist, of course, not a religious person. But there's a very good phrase from the Quran which says, "La ikraha fi din." It means there's no compulsion in religion. So China is not forcing anyone to buy their goods. So when you fear China, and I do sense that there is a kind of fear of China all over the world, and maybe we're right to be afraid of China, but it's not the same as fear of the United States or fear of the IMF. Fear of the United States is fear at the barrel of a gun. You have no, if you don't do what we say, we will intervene militarily, and we have, and we continue to, right? Fear of the IMF is basically, it's an extension of the U.S. And they have various measures, structural adjustment measures, that are now no longer as relevant because none of our countries, very few of our countries, have those kind of agreements with the IMF anymore after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, after the crisis in Argentina in 2001. Most countries figured out, hey, we don't want to work with the IMF in that way. Greece is a notable exception. My apologies to European comrades, but this is the case in Latin America at the moment. So if we're looking for solutions, the solutions really have to come at national and maybe at regional levels. You have to build your own industries that are accountable to the people and not just to the profit motive, right? That has a lot of implications for trade. So when we're talking about these trade agreements, even the very technical discussions that we've had at the end of yesterday and today, when we have these kind of discussions, we need to be understanding that is a political decision to support certain industries over others. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. What industries are we going to support? What is our national development plan? And how can we base that on economies, on economic actors that are more like responsible citizens than like the dysfunctional citizens that have been bred through the Anglo, French system of corporate governance, which we can talk more about. I mean, but maybe it's important to make a sentence just about that model. That being that there's a very famous case going back to the 1920s. The case is Dodge v. Ford. So this has to do with Ford Motor Cars. Henry Ford wanted to pay his workers a little bit more, not a lot more, a little bit more than the market wage, yes? And the hope was that if you pay them a little bit more, well, they can save a little bit more and they can, Ambassador, sorry, I didn't see you there. I didn't mean to refer to you in the third person earlier. Apologies. I would have spoken directly to you. I didn't see you there. So he wanted to pay his workers a little bit more than they would have been making. What he was sued by one of his board members, he was sued. And the judge in this case, it was taken, I believe, to a court in New York. The judge basically came up with a ruling that it is not allowed for a company to have any motives, to have any kind of basic motivation other than the profit motive. So if you can pay your workers less, you must pay your workers less. It's not a question of if, right? So, and that is a principle that's embedded in US, UK corporate law. And it's one that I hope that we are not adopting in our own countries. I hope that we are moving beyond that. We're trying to create companies, we're trying to create socially, not just this sort of discourse of socially responsible additions put on top, but that we're actually creating companies that are responsible to the communities in which they operate. We might need to move towards economies based on commodities, move away from commodities economy, whereas to work towards value addition, industrialization. A final thought. A lot of what I've said is not very profound. Apologies for that. I don't have the expertise of Professor Marta. But the problem we have is not really a technical problem. The problem is a political system. When we're talking about your Vale or the big agribusiness companies in sugarcane in Brazil, what are we talking about? We're talking about companies that are owned and controlled by the same elites who control our government, right, to some extent. And they'd have, even with the PT, even with parties that have come from this very revolutionary background, that have come to power through struggle, we find that those leaders, as we're seeing now in Brazil very dramatically unfolding, we're seeing that those leaders are very tied up with those corporations. And therefore they benefit. If we have a system that is skewed towards a certain kind of neoliberal or even neo-colonial basis, those elites are benefiting. So it becomes very difficult to change the model. I think even people like Lula, even people like Chavez, if we want to fault them, if we want to find criticism of them, the criticism really is that they only sort of envisioned one or two steps in advance. And I think what we're learning, so as I mentioned ALCA, I mentioned the struggle of the Zapatistas and so on. As we're learning from those struggles, as we're learning from our own successes and our own failures, I think we need to think many steps in the future. We need to think about how we are going to actually make fundamental transformations to the system, and not just, I used to make a joke about what we called second generation structural adjustments, right? So this was like, you ensure that, yes, you privatize your schools, but you make sure that everyone gets some kind of a subsidy to make sure that they can attend and so on. So it's as if you've cut off the arm, you've cut off the public services, but you have a really nice bandage, you have a very nice cast, or you've made someone break their arm, but you're giving them really good medicine. Well, how about we try and come up with a system that does not injure us in the first place? And there may be several steps for getting there, but when I look at Latin America, when I look at Brazil, the impression I get is that we just have not envisioned far enough down the line, and the result is that we are constantly breaking our arm one day and repairing it the next. In other words, in the old days, the struggle was against the IMF. In the old days, the struggle was against Portugal, Spain, US, some of these colonial powers. We're now at the point where we kind of have to decolonize ourselves. We have to sort of ask ourselves, to what extent have we been completely brought up and raised in the system, and we have engendered our own colonists. We are the authors of our own demise. So thank you very much.